In the early hours of June 7, 1951, 7 men were led one by one to a military gallows in Bavaria. Among them were the commanders responsible for the largest massacres of the Holocaust. They did not die in combat, nor did they flee from trial. They were executed after a trial that revealed how they had designed, directed, and perfected the murder of nearly 1 million people in Eastern Europe. They were lawyers, economists, academics. They didn't kill with their bare hands, but with signatures, lists, and orders. How did this intellectual elite become administrators of genocide? What methods did they use to wipe out entire peoples? And how did the weight of international justice finally fall upon them? The genesis of the Einsatzgruppe, the formation of the death squad. In the months leading up to World War II, as German military forces prepared to expand eastward, a plan darker than the war itself was taking shape at SS headquarters. The Nazi regime envisioned a radical transformation of Eastern Europe through the systematic elimination of entire populations. For this task, they needed a specific tool: mobile extermination units that would act as the vanguard of death. Thus were born the Einsatzgruppen, squads designed not to fight armies, but to eliminate those whom Nazism considered racial and ideological threats. The conception of these groups arose directly from the racial vision of Nazism, which categorized Jews, communists, and large sectors of the Slavic population as subhuman elements or biological threats to the Germanic future. Heinrich Himmler, Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the SS, and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich transformed this ideology into a methodical operational structure. Both understood that the lands conquered by the Wehrmacht must be pacified, a term that in Nazi lexicon meant the systematic elimination of any element considered incompatible with the new order. During the summer of 1939, weeks before the invasion of Poland, Heydrich gathered senior officers from the Gestapo, the Sicherheitsdienst, and the German criminal police, tasking them with forming special units. Their mission? To operate in the rear of the advancing military forces to combat all elements hostile to the Reich. This deliberately ambiguous definition would allow commanders to interpret their orders with wide latitude, justifying any level of brutality against the civilian population. On September 1, 1939, when the Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border, 5 operational groups were already in place. Each consisted of between 300 and 500 men selected from various branches of the Reich security forces. Their internal organization revealed a system designed to maximize the efficiency of terror. The Einsatzgruppen were subdivided into smaller units, the Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos, which operated with mobility and tactical autonomy, allowing them to cover large rural areas and urban centers simultaneously. Poland became the first laboratory for these units. During the initial months of the occupation, they carried out Operation Tannenberg, aimed at systematically eliminating the Polish intellectual elite. Armed with pre-drawn lists that included more than 61,000 names of professors, artists, priests, politicians, and nobles, the Einsatzgruppen executed thousands in a matter of weeks. Between September 1939 and January 1940, more than 20,000 Polish civilians were murdered in 760 separate operations. The real turning point would come with the planning of Operation Barbarossa. During the spring of 1941, as military strategists prepared the largest ground offensive in modern history, Himmler and Heydrich reconfigured and expanded the Einsatzgruppen. 4 new units were formed, each assigned to a specific sector of the Eastern Front. Einsatzgruppe A, directed towards the Baltic countries and the Leningrad area. Einsatzgruppe B, intended to operate in Belarus and the Moscow region. Einsatzgruppe C, assigned to central Ukraine and the Kiev area. Einsatzgruppe D, oriented towards southern Ukraine and Crimea. These new groups were more numerous and lethal than their predecessors. Each group numbered between 600 and 1,000, with approximately 3,000 men dedicated exclusively to mop-up operations in the rear. Their composition had also been diversified, incorporating administrative personnel, interrogation specialists, mobile communications units, and even doctors. Days before the start of the invasion, Heydrich gathered all commanders in Berlin for final instructions. The language used at this meeting reflected the calculated ambiguity that characterized all orders related to extermination. Preemptive action against enemies of the Reich was discussed, specifically targeting political commissars, saboteurs, and Jews in positions of influence. This vague terminology created a framework broad enough to allow for any interpretation on the ground while maintaining a semblance of military legality. The selection of commanders for these units revealed the profile the regime considered ideal for directing the genocide. Men like Otto Ohlendorf, Einsatzgruppe D, Erich Naumann, later Einsatzgruppe B, Paul Blobel, Sonderkommando 4A, and Werner Braun, Sonderkommando 11B, shared specific characteristics: advanced academic training, administrative experience, unwavering ideological loyalty, and a worldview that allowed them to rationalize extermination as a historical necessity. Many were lawyers, economists, or doctors of philosophy who applied their intellect to the methodical organization of mass murder. A central element in the operation of the Einsatzgruppen was tactical autonomy combined with full political support. Unlike other structures of the Third Reich, characterized by rigid chains of command, these squadrons enjoyed broad operational freedom. This initiative became a perverse incentive to demonstrate efficiency in achieving barely expressed objectives. Commanders did not wait for specific orders. They interpreted, decided, and executed, knowing that any action that furthered racial cleansing would be approved by Berlin. By the end of 1941, with Operation Barbarossa still in progress, the Einsatzgruppen had evolved from auxiliary security units to become the primary instrument of extermination in Eastern Europe. Before the first concentration camp began full-scale operations, these mobile squads had murdered hundreds of thousands of people in the largest mass execution program the world had ever known. The East in Flames, the extermination operation on Soviet lands. The dawn of June 22, 1941 marked the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, as 3 million German soldiers advanced on the Soviet Union on a front stretching more than 2,900 kilometers. A different force was moving behind them. The Einsatzgruppen, now fully operational, were beginning the deadliest phase of their existence, transforming the occupied territories into sites of systematic extermination that would surpass any historical precedent. In the Baltic states, Einsatzgruppe A found particularly favorable conditions. Decades of ethnic tensions and the recent Soviet domination had created an environment conducive to local collaboration. In Kaunas, Lithuania, German squads barely needed to intervene when Lithuanian militiamen massacred more than 3,800 Jews in the first days of the occupation. Later, at the city's Fort Ninth, systematic executions eliminated nearly 30,000 people during the summer and fall of 1941. Otto Ohlendorf, commanding Einsatzgruppe D, implemented an almost scientific approach to extermination. Trained in economics and law, he applied principles of administrative efficiency to the organization of massacres. Unlike other commanders, Ohlendorf preferred a method of execution that limited direct contact between executioners and victims, synchronized firing squads that fired simultaneously, supposedly to reduce the psychological burden on the perpetrators. This technical rationalization of murder reflected the mentality that allowed genocide to be turned into an administrative process. Between October and December 1941, under Ohlendorf's direction, units of Einsatzgruppe D carried out an extermination operation in Simferopol, Crimea, where more than 14,000 Jews, Roma, and Communists were executed in just 1 week. Ohlendorf himself later acknowledged that his unit had been responsible for the deaths of at least 90,000 people during his command, although recovered documents put this figure as high as 134,000. Werner Braun, commander of Sonderkommando 11B, part of Einsatzgruppe D, demonstrated particular zeal during the so-called Bloody Christmas in Simferopol. Between December 11th and 13, 1941, his men shot more than 14,000 Jews on the outskirts of the city. Witnesses described how the victims were forced to walk naked in the snow, line up in front of dug trenches, and were shot in the back of the head. Braun personally supervised the operation, demanding efficiency and speed from his subordinates. In central Ukraine, Einsatzgruppe C, specifically Sonderkommando 4, commanded by Paul Blobel, carried out one of the most iconic massacres of the Holocaust, Babi Yar. On September 29th and 30, 1941, nearly 34,000 Kiev Jews were herded into a ravine on the outskirts of the city. In a meticulously planned operation, the victims were stripped, lined up in groups, and executed by machine gun fire over the edge of the ravine. Blobel, an architect by profession, applied his technical mindset to the organization of the extermination. He established a system whereby the victims were forced to lie on the bodies of those who had just been murdered, creating successive layers in the pits. The efficiency achieved was such that in just 2 days, one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust was completed. Years later, when interrogated, Blobel would remark with chilling detachment, "Here lie my 30,000 Jews." In Belarus, Erich Naumann assumed command of Einsatzgruppe B in 1941, implementing a program of systematic cleansing of the Jewish population in the Minsk, Mogilev, and Smolensk regions. The reports Naumann sent to Berlin reflected the administrative coldness with which these massacres were recorded. Between November and December, 17,256 enemies were liquidated. The Jewish problem in the territory has been solved. Naumann personally supervised many of these operations, demanding precision in both the executions and the subsequent statistical records. Rumbula Forest was the scene of another coordinated massacre. Friedrich Jeckeln, a senior SS officer working with the Einsatzgruppen, developed a unique method for streamlining mass executions. Victims were forced to lie in layers inside the pits, while marksmen moved along the edges, firing methodically. This Jeckeln method led to the elimination of more than 25,000 Jews from the Riga ghetto between November 30th and December 8, 1941. The Einsatzgruppen did not operate in isolation. Their effectiveness depended largely on the collaboration of auxiliary units recruited from the local population: Ukrainian police, Baltic militiamen, Belarusian guards. This participation exponentially expanded the operational capacity of the German squadrons and created networks of complicity that would later hinder any reconciliation process. Entire populations became witnesses, participants, or victims, generating social fractures that would last for generations. The human impact of these operations was captured in the few testimonies of survivors. Stories such as that of Dina Pronicheva, who managed to escape Babi Yar by feigning death among the corpses, or that of Yosef Kogan, who survived an execution in Crimea after a bullet grazed his head but did not kill him, offer glimpses of the indescribable horror experienced by the victims. These eyewitnesses would later be key figures in the trials of the Einsatzgruppen commanders. By 1943, the toll was terrifying. According to documents later recovered, the 4 main Einsatzgruppen had executed more than 900,000 people, mainly Jews, but also Roma, communists, intellectuals, and others classified as undesirable elements by the Nazi regime. This already shocking figure does not include the killings carried out by auxiliary units or special army formations operating in coordination with these squads. Unlike the extermination camps, which operated in fixed and relatively isolated facilities, the Einsatzgruppen operated in plain sight of the local population, in open spaces, often with the participation of auxiliaries recruited from among the civilian population. This visibility of the genocide created a network of complicity and silence that would persist long after the war's end. Entire villages witnessed massacres occurring just a few kilometers from their homes. Silence among the graves, the cover-up of the Nazi crime. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked an irreversible turning point in World War II. The Soviet advance would radically alter the operational dynamics of the Einsatzgruppen, transforming their mission and methods. Now they had to not only continue the executions in ever-shrinking territories, but also undertake an unprecedented task, eliminating evidence of their crimes while maintaining the final cleansing of potential witnesses. Heinrich Himmler, aware of the political and military implications of the discovery of the mass graves, ordered Operation Action 1005 in June 1942. This initiative, led by Paul Blobel, represented a macabre twist in the history of genocide. After killing millions, the Nazis were now undertaking a systematic effort to make the dead disappear a second time. Blobel's mission was to exhume and destroy the bodies in all areas that would soon be reconquered by the Red Army. The implementation of Action 1005 revealed new dimensions of the Nazi technocratic mindset. Blobel, applying his training as an architect, developed specific methods for the mass cremation of corpses: combustion chambers constructed from railway rails to allow for ventilation, optimized fuel mixtures, and techniques for crushing fire-resistant bones. These innovations demonstrate how the regime channeled substantial intellectual and technical resources into concealing its crimes, with the same dedication it had previously applied to committing them. The special units formed for this task, called Sonderkommandos 1005, were composed primarily of Jewish prisoners taken from nearby camps and ghettos. These men, forced to disinter and burn the bodies of their compatriots, worked under extreme physical and psychological conditions, knowing that they would be executed upon completion. This use of victims as instruments to erase evidence added an additional layer of perversion to the system. The very people being persecuted were forced to participate in eliminating evidence of their own genocide. In parallel with these covert efforts, the Einsatzgruppen's operational methods evolved to adapt to the new circumstances at the front. The open-air mass executions characteristic of the initial phase were now too visible and risky. This led to an intensification of the use of more discreet methods, such as gas trucks, gas wagon, specially designed vehicles designed to asphyxiate their occupants by redirecting carbon monoxide from the exhaust into an airtight compartment at the rear. These death vehicles, used primarily in cities such as Minsk, Kharkov, and Riga, allowed groups of 50 people to be eliminated simultaneously without the telltale sound of gunfire. The operators' experience reflects the extreme dehumanization of the process. They reported technical problems such as the accumulation of biological waste between operations or the need to rev the engine in certain sections to ensure a lethal concentration of gas, concerns that demonstrated a complete dissociation between action and moral significance. As the front crumbled and German troops began to retreat, a new phase of killing began: the elimination of witnesses and the final liquidation of the remaining ghettos and camps. Between 1943 and 1944, alongside the destruction of evidence, SS commanders ordered evacuations that were in reality summary executions. The objective was twofold: to eliminate mouths to feed during the retreat and, more importantly, to ensure that no one survived to testify. In Lviv, Ukraine, more than 15,000 prisoners from the Yanovska camp were executed in November 1943 as Soviet forces approached. In the Minsk ghetto, the last 2,000 inhabitants were murdered in October of the same year. In Kaunas, Lithuania, the SS carried out a final massacre of 2,000 prisoners in July 1944, hours before Soviet troops entered the city. These final operations, carried out under extreme time pressure, often lacked the bureaucratic meticulousness of earlier phases, but maintained the same goal of systematic extermination. A particularly sinister aspect of this final phase was the elimination of local collaborators. Those who had assisted the Germans, auxiliary police officers, translators, administrators, were frequently executed to eliminate witnesses who knew the chain of command and the internal organization of the massacres. This final cleansing reflects the calculating mentality that characterized all operations. Each witness eliminated represented one less accusation in a future trial. Einsatzgruppen commanders, the impending collapse of the Reich posed critical decisions about their personal futures. Otto Ohlendorf, following his time at the head of Einsatzgruppe D, had been transferred to the Ministry of Economics, where he applied his administrative skills to seemingly conventional tasks. Faced with imminent defeat, he adopted a civilian identity and attempted to disappear into the chaos of post-war Germany. Paul Blobel, after completing Action 1005, was discharged due to alcoholism, a common condition among those directly involved in mass executions. Aware of the implications of his actions, he obtained false documents and went into hiding in rural West Germany. Erich Naumann, who had led Einsatzgruppe B in Belarus, was transferred to the Ministry of the Interior in 1944, a typical case of the reintegration of specialists into the civilian administration. As his death drew to a close, Naumann also opted for hiding, although his attempts to escape from Germany were thwarted. Werner Brauner, who was responsible for the executions in Crimea as head of Sonderkommando 11B, remained in his position until the later stages of the war. He subsequently went into hiding under a false identity, hoping that the post-war chaos would allow him to evade responsibility. As these men attempted to erase their identities, evidence of their crimes inexorably emerged. As the Red Army advanced, special investigative units documented massacre sites. photographed partially burned graves, and collected testimony. In many places, Action 1005 operations had been interrupted by the rapid Soviet advance, leaving only partial but sufficient evidence to reconstruct the events. Hunted among ruins, the final siege of the death squad leaders. In May 1945, as Soviet flags waved over a Berlin reduced to rubble, the men who had orchestrated the systematic slaughter in Eastern Europe dispersed like shadows. Germany's unconditional surrender marked the end of the Third Reich, but the final act of justice was only just beginning. For the Einsatzgruppen commanders, the defeat triggered a desperate race for invisibility that would ultimately prove unsuccessful. The final weeks of the war had been chaotic. Heinrich Himmler, anticipating the outcome, distributed false documentation, new identities, and escape routes among his officers. This improvised plan allowed hundreds of war criminals to blend in with the displaced population or assume fictitious personalities. The collapse of the German central administration created ideal conditions for disappearance. Archives destroyed, records burned, communications systems rendered useless. Europe had become a labyrinth where the executioners of the Nazi regime sought to become anonymous survivors. For the Allies, capturing those responsible for the Holocaust became a strategic priority, not only for justice, but also because they could provide vital information about the structure of the Nazi regime and its still undocumented crimes. The US Army established the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, a unit specialized in tracking down war criminals. Its methodology combined documentary research with systematic interrogations, creating an information network that would gradually close in on the fugitives. Otto Ohlendorf, former commander of Einsatzgruppe D and directly responsible for the deaths of at least 90,000 people in southern Ukraine and Crimea, was one of the first captured. After leaving his post at the Ministry of Economics, he attempted to hide in northern Germany under the identity of a minor administrative official. His capture in May 1945 proved surprisingly simple. He was detained by British troops during a routine document check. Initially, he was not recognized, but during preliminary interrogations, inconsistencies in his story raised suspicions. Confronted with evidence, Ohlendorf revealed his true identity. What followed defied his interrogators' expectations. Far from denying his involvement, Ohlendorf provided exhaustive details about the organization and operations of Einsatzgruppe D. He described with bureaucratic precision the execution procedures, the chain of command, and the methods used to maximize the efficiency of the killings. His analytical coolness in detailing these crimes left a deep impression on Allied officers, one of whom noted, "He talks about thousands of executions as if discussing industrial production figures." Paul Blobel, an architect by profession and perpetrator of the Babi Yar massacre, followed a different path. After leading Action 1005 to eliminate evidence of the killings, he had been partially sidelined by alcoholism. When the front collapsed, Blobel went into hiding under the name Wilhelm Blom in Düsseldorf, where he was captured in June 1945 by American forces. His identification was made possible through the help of a former subordinate who, seeking to reduce his own sentence, provided information on the whereabouts of his former superior. Unlike Ohlendorf, Blobel initially attempted to deny his identity and minimize his involvement in the crimes. However, the mounting evidence was overwhelming. Maps with the locations of mass graves and documents relating to mass cremation procedures were found in his home. Even more devastating were the testimonies of Ukrainian survivors who unequivocally identified him as the commander who oversaw the executions at Babi Yar. The capture of Erich Naumann, head of Einsatzgruppe B in Belarus, revealed similar patterns of escape and identification. Naumann had taken refuge in Bavaria, assuming the identity of a farmer. A seemingly trivial detail gave him away. During a routine interrogation, a former German soldier recognized his name on a list and provided information about his true rank and function. CIC agents located him working on a farm, deliberately keeping a low profile. Naumann, unlike his colleagues, maintained a defiant demeanor after his arrest. During preliminary interrogations, he not only admitted his role, but justified it as necessary for the security of the Reich and German victory. This stance, far from benefiting him, provided investigators with explicit confessions that would later be used as evidence against him. His case illustrated a disturbing reality. Many perpetrators did not consider themselves to have acted wrongly, reflecting the profound moral distortion that the Nazi regime had normalized. Werner Braun, commander of Sonderkommando 11B and organizer of the Simferopol massacre, adopted a different strategy. After the German defeat, he settled in Hamburg using false documentation provided by the security headquarters. His capture came about by coincidence. A Jewish survivor from Crimea, now in a displaced persons camp, recognized his photograph shown to investigators tracking SS members. Braun was arrested in January 1946 and, confronted with the evidence, attempted to distance himself from operational decisions, claiming that he was simply transmitting orders from Berlin. This defensive strategy collapsed when Allied investigators recovered documents signed by him in the RSHA, Reich Security Main Office archives. These documents included detailed reports on the Christmas action in Simferopol, where more than 14,000 Jews were executed in 3 days under his direct supervision. Testimony from subordinates confirmed that Braun not only transmitted orders but personally directed operations on the ground. In parallel with these individual captures, the Allies carried out meticulous work gathering evidence. Specialized teams recovered files from SS headquarters in Berlin, including the weekly reports sent by the Einsatzgruppen. These documents, known as Ereignismeldungen, UdSSR, reports on the situation in the USSR, constituted a bureaucratic record of the extermination with precise data on the number of executions, location, and categories of victims. Documentary evidence was complemented by testimonies from witnesses and survivors. In displaced persons camps across Europe, researchers interviewed people who had witnessed the massacres or had miraculously escaped. These accounts provided the human element that official documents concealed behind their sterile language. Stories like Rivka's Yoselewska, who survived an execution in Poland by feigning death under a pile of corpses, transformed statistics into tangible human tragedy. A crucial element in the investigation was photographic evidence. During operations in the East, many German soldiers had photographed executions, either as an official record or as personal mementos. These images, recovered from prisoners or found in abandoned archives, provided incontrovertible visual evidence. Photographs from Babi Yar, showing long lines of people heading for the ravine, or images of executions in Lithuania showing SS officers supervising the shootings, constituted direct evidence that no defense could refute. Einsatzgruppen commanders were in Allied custody. Preliminary investigative work had produced detailed dossiers on each, including personal statements, witness testimony, signed documents, and photographic evidence. This methodologically organized material formed the basis for what would become one of the most significant judicial proceedings of the 20th century. The magnitude of the documented crimes was overwhelming even for researchers accustomed to the horrors of war. Each commander had acted not as a soldier in combat, but as an administrator of genocide, planning, organizing, and overseeing the extermination with the same meticulousness that others might apply to civilian or commercial projects. Prosecutor Telford Taylor, appointed to lead the prosecution at the Nuremberg trials, understood the uniqueness of these cases. Unlike other war criminals who had operated in concentration camps or from offices in Berlin, the Einsatzgruppen commanders had been present on the ground, personally directing the extermination operations. Their actions could not be attributed to abstract orders or collective decisions. They had made specific decisions about how, when, and where to kill thousands of defenseless civilians. Taylor assigned the case to Benjamin Ferencz, a young lawyer of just 27 years old, had participated in the liberation of several concentration camps. Shocked by the evidence gathered, Ferencz developed a straightforward prosecutorial strategy. The Nazi documents themselves, with their precise details and authenticated signatures, would be the focus of the prosecution. The case was not about interpreting intentions or reconstructing events, but rather about presenting the administrative record of a genocide documented by its perpetrators. With the case underway, the captured commanders were transferred to Nuremberg, where a U.S. military tribunal would be established to try them. There, in the city that had been the site of lavish Nazi parades, these men would finally face the consequences of their actions. The impending trial would not only establish their individual responsibility, but would also set legal precedents on the nature of crimes against humanity and the limits of due obedience. Tribunal of No Escape, the trial of the architects of genocide. On the morning of September 29, 1947, a courtroom in the Nuremberg Palace of Justice prepared for the beginning of one of the most shocking trials in modern legal history. The American tribunal, presided over by Michael A. Musmano, would for the first time confront the direct commanders of the death squads that operated behind the lines of the Eastern Front. On trial were not desk officers or distant ideologues, but men who had been on the ground, personally directing the extermination of entire communities. This trial, officially designated Case Num 9 of the Nuremberg trials, would go down in history as the Einsatzgruppen trial. The defendants, 24 high-ranking officers of the SS, South Dakota, and Gestapo, formed an atypical group among Nazi war criminals. 14 of them held doctorates in law, philosophy, or economics. They were not ignorant fanatics, but educated and cultured men who had applied their intellectual abilities to the systematic organization of genocide. Prominent among them were the now familiar figures of Otto Ohlendorf, Erich Naumann, Paul Blobel, and Werner Braun. The prosecution was headed by Benjamin Ferencz, whose youth belied the magnitude of the case he was tasked with presenting. Ferencz possessed an invaluable quality. He had personally participated in the liberation of concentration camps and the collection of evidence about the crimes of the Einsatzgruppen. He knew not only the documents, but also the tangible reality of the horror they represented. Ferencz's opening statement set the tone for the proceedings. In a clear and direct voice, he outlined the scope of the case. The defendants were commanders and officers of special units whose specific function was to exterminate human beings. In total, they killed more than 1 million men, women, and children. In terms of its magnitude, this is the largest murder case ever brought before a court. The simplicity of this statement belied its devastating content. These were not abstract crimes against collective entities, but the systematic murder of specific individuals, each with a name and a story. The prosecution's strategy departed from the approach used at the Nuremberg main trial. Rather than constructing a complex narrative about the Nazi conspiracy, Ferencz opted for a minimalist approach, letting the German documents themselves speak. He presented the court with 253 official Einsatzgruppen reports, each detailing with bureaucratic precision the number of people executed, the dates, locations, and methods employed. These reports, written by the defendants themselves or under their direct supervision, bore authenticated signatures and official seals. A typical document dated December 1941 and signed Otto Ohlendorf reported with cold statistics on executions carried out over a 2-week period, meticulously classifying the victims into categories: Jews, communists, the mentally ill. The administrative coldness of these reports was more incriminating than any emotional testimony. The perpetrators had meticulously documented their own genocide, creating a record that was now being turned against them. In addition to the written reports, the prosecution presented photographic evidence recovered from German soldiers and military archives. Images of mass executions at Babi Yar, Ponary, and other sites visually confirmed what the documents described. Some photographs showed the defendants themselves overseeing operations, refuting any attempt to deny their direct presence at the crime scenes. To supplement the documentary evidence, the prosecution called witnesses who survived the massacres. Their testimonies provided the human dimension missing from the cold, statistical reports. A woman who survived the Babi Yar massacre described seeing Paul Blobel directing the soldiers organizing the execution lines. A man who escaped from a mass grave in Crimea identified Werner Braun among the officers overseeing the shootings. These accounts transformed numbers into faces, statistics into personal tragedies. Faced with this mountain of evidence, the defendants developed 3 main lines of defense: due obedience, military necessity, and partial denial. Otto Ohlendorf, with his characteristic pragmatism, opted for a technical defense. He admitted to the executions but argued that he was simply following orders from above and that they were legal in the context of the war against Bolshevism. He even went so far as to claim that the methods employed by his unit were more humane because they ensured a swift death for the victims. Paul Blobel, confronted with testimony about his role at Babi Yar, initially denied being present but faced with photographic evidence changed his strategy. He claimed psychological pressure and fear of reprisals if he disobeyed orders. His testimony revealed disturbing details about Action 1005, the operation to unearth and burn bodies which he himself directed in an attempt to erase evidence of the genocide. Erich Naumann adopted a defiant stance. Far from denying the events, he justified them as necessary actions in the context of an existential war against Judeo-Bolshevism. When asked if he considered the mass executions of civilians morally wrong, he replied coldly, "No, Your Honor, it was my duty and I did it." This response, more than any documentary evidence, revealed the moral distortion that had allowed the Nazi system to operate. Werner Braun attempted to distance himself from direct responsibility, arguing that he was merely transmitting orders from Berlin. However, documents signed by him detailed specific instructions on execution methods, the selection of mass grave sites, and procedures for handling confiscated property. His own words incriminated him as an active planner, not a mere passive executor. During the cross-examination, Benjamin Ferencz exposed the contradictions in the defendants' defenses. If they had truly acted under duress, why did none of them request transfer to other units, an option available to SS officers? If the executions responded to legitimate military needs, why did they systematically include women, children, and the elderly? If they were merely following orders, why did the reports show local initiatives and tactical decisions that exceeded general directives? The turning point of the trial came when Ferencz questioned Ohlendorf about the execution of children. "Did you consider it necessary to kill babies as young as months old?" he asked. "Ohlendorf," he responded with chilling logic. "It was inevitable, we couldn't make exceptions." When pressed on the moral justification for these actions, he explained that Jewish children would grow up to become enemies of the Reich, so their elimination was preemptive. This statement encapsulated the essence of Nazi genocidal thinking, the total dehumanization that allowed human beings to be classified as biological threats to be eliminated. On April 10, 1948, the court, presided over by Michael Musmano, issued its verdict. In a 175-page document, it meticulously analyzed the evidence and the defenses presented. The conclusion was resounding. The defendants in this case are not mere bureaucrats who signed orders from behind a desk. They are conscious murderers, executors of the greatest crime ever committed against humanity. They participated in, led, and perfected the annihilation of entire populations with cold logic and ideological determination. The court categorically rejected the defense of due obedience, establishing a fundamental legal precedent. No military order can justify the systematic killing of defenseless civilians. It also dismissed the argument of military necessity, stating that women, children, and the elderly did not constitute a war threat that justified their elimination. Finally, it refuted the notion that the defendants were unaware of the illegality of their actions. Men with your legal and academic training could not have been unaware that the mass murder of civilians contravened fundamental principles of international law. The sentences reflected the gravity of the crimes. 14 death sentences, including those of Otto Ohlendorf, Paul Blobel, Erich Naumann, and Werner Braun. 2 life sentences. 5 sentences of between 10 and 20 years. 3 acquittals due to insufficient individual evidence. Upon hearing his verdict, Otto Ohlendorf remained impassive, maintaining the same technical composure he had displayed when describing the mass executions. Paul Blobel paled, visibly, but did not speak. Erich Naumann nodded slightly, as if accepting an unavoidable statistical fact. Werner Braun looked at the judges for a long time, but showed no recognizable emotion. None expressed regret or recognition of the harm caused. Einsatzgruppen trial set several crucial legal precedents. It confirmed that individual responsibility for war crimes cannot be diluted up the chain of command. It defined the concept of crimes against humanity as a legal category applicable beyond specific conflicts. It established that the systematic killing of civilians constitutes a crime per se, regardless of the context of war, and perhaps most importantly, it placed genocide within the scope of international justice, not as a historical abstraction, but as a punishable act with specific perpetrators. Benjamin. In his closing argument, Ferencz had emphasized the historical dimension of the proceedings. This trial is not just about 24 men. It is about the very notion that human beings can be classified as expendable and eliminated by administrative decision. It is a trial against dehumanization as a method of government. This perspective went beyond the specific case, pointing to fundamental principles of human dignity and moral responsibility. For the victims and survivors scattered across Europe, the verdict represented an official acknowledgement of their suffering. The Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, devastated by the Einsatzgruppen's operations, were seeing for the first time how justice had specifically named the crimes committed against them. The testimony, documents, and photographs presented at the trial would constitute a permanent historical record, countering future attempts at denial. Internationally, the case prompted reflection on the nature of evil in modern societies. The defendants were not recognizable monsters, but educated individuals who had applied their intellect to organizing extermination. Their participation raised disturbing questions about the fragility of ethical norms in the face of totalizing ideologies. Following the sentencing, the condemned men were transferred to Landsberg prison in Bavaria, where they would remain during appeals and legal reviews. This same prison, in a historical irony, had housed Adolf Hitler during his incarceration in 1924 when he wrote Mein Kampf. Now it housed men who had implemented the darkest visions of that text, closing an ideological cycle that had led Europe to its deepest moral crisis. Hanging, the executions of the Einsatzgruppe commanders. On the night of June 6, 1951, a tense silence hung in the corridors of Landsberg am Lech prison in Bavaria. Rain pounded rhythmically against the stone walls of this fortress that, in a historical irony, had housed Adolf Hitler after the failed Munich Putsch of 1923. Now, nearly 3 decades later, its cells held the executors of the apocalypse Hitler had conceived within those very walls. 7 men waited for midnight, knowing they would not see the dawn. Among them were the 4 top Einsatzgruppen commanders, Otto Ohlendorf, Paul Blobel, Erich Naumann, and Werner Braun. 3 years had passed since the Nuremberg tribunal had handed down its sentences. Appeals, reviews, and petitions for clemency had been systematically rejected. In April 1951, John J. McCloy, the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, definitively confirmed the executions. The date was set for June 7th. Preparations proceeded with the same methodical precision that the condemned men had applied years before in their extermination operations. During the days leading up to the execution, prison staff had prepared a special room in the inner courtyard. Following U.S. protocol for military executions, a scaffold was erected with a raised platform, a mechanical trapdoor, and a rope calibrated to technical specifications. A military doctor supervised the installation, verifying that the height of the fall was sufficient to cause instant death by cervical fracture, thus avoiding prolonged strangulation. The condemned prisoners were offered spiritual assistance, which most accepted. Protestant and Catholic chaplains visited them in their cells, where they received the last rites according to their respective confessions. They were also allowed a special last meal and to write farewell letters to their families. The letters were subjected to military censorship before being sent, eliminating any political content or ideological justifications. The protocol established for the executions reflected the seriousness with which the U.S. authorities approached the procedure. Each execution would be supervised by an army officer, a doctor, a chaplain, and official witnesses. A military photographer would document the process with images that would later be classified. The sequence of executions was determined by the rank and responsibility of the condemned men. Minutes after midnight on June 7th, the guards presented themselves at Otto Ohlendorf's cell. The former commander of Einsatzgruppe D had meticulously prepared for this moment. Dressed in a grey prison uniform without insignia, his hair was carefully combed. At 44, he maintained the same technical composure that had characterized his SS career. The guards handcuffed his hands behind his back and escorted him down the dimly lit corridor toward the inner courtyard. A Protestant chaplain walked beside him, offering words of comfort that Ohlendorf seemed to barely hear. His analytical mind was probably processing these final moments as it had processed so many execution reports, with professional detachment. Upon entering the execution chamber, Ohlendorf briefly glanced at the scaffold, a black-painted wooden structure that rose against the back wall. He climbed the 13 steps with a steady stride, needing no assistance. On the platform, the chief executioner and his assistant checked the handcuffs and placed additional straps around his ankles. The chaplain asked him if he wished to say a few final words. "Germany above all," Ohlendorf said, repeating a phrase that had defined his life. He expressed no regret or acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. The executioner then placed a black hood over his head and secured the rope around his neck, tightening the knot according to procedure. Following a signal from the supervising officer, he activated the mechanism that released the trapdoor. At 12:04 a.m., Otto Ohlendorf abruptly fell. The doctor confirmed his death 12 minutes later, certifying death by cervical fracture and asphyxiation. The body was taken down, placed on a stretcher, and covered with a sheet. While attendants prepared the gallows for the next execution, Ohlendorf was taken to an adjacent room where he would be examined again and prepared for burial. The man who had built his career on the administrative efficiency of genocide had just experienced the administrative efficiency of justice. At 12:22 a.m., Erich Naumann was led to the same location. The former commander of Einsatzgruppe B, responsible for systematic killings in Belarus and Russia, had a different attitude from Ohlendorf. At 46, he seemed to have accepted his fate with a certain detachment. On the way from his cell, he chatted briefly with the chaplain who accompanied him. Upon reaching the gallows, Naumann surprised those present by offering a slight smile as if appreciating the irony of the situation. He climbed the steps with dignity and stood over the trapdoor without resistance. When asked if he had any final words, he responded clearly, "I have no regrets." This brief statement encapsulated the same unwavering conviction he had displayed during his trial, when he asserted that his actions had been necessary for Germany's survival. The military photographer captured his image just before the black hood was placed over him, his serene face contrasting with the gravity of the moment. At 12:29, the trapdoor opened and Naumann fell into the void. The doctor recorded his death as rapid, without a visible struggle, noting the exact time according to military protocol. The third execution fell to Paul Blobel, perhaps the most notorious of the condemned due to his role in the Bavaria massacre and the subsequent cover-up. At 12:34, Blobel was escorted to the gallows. Unlike his predecessors, he showed visible signs of physical and emotional deterioration. At 56, the effects of alcoholism and the stress of prolonged incarceration had weakened his constitution. Blobel advanced with unsteady steps, needing assistance to climb the steps. His hands were visibly shaking even under the handcuffs. When he reached the platform, he looked long and hard into the empty room, as if searching for something or someone that wasn't present. When asked to speak his last words, he made a statement that shook even the officers present with its mixture of cynicism and pride. "Here lie my 30,000 Jews." This phrase, which he had uttered years earlier during an inspection of the Bavaria ravine, revealed that even in the face of death, Blobel continued to regard the genocide as a personal achievement. There was no regret, only a factual acknowledgement of his responsibility. The executioner acted swiftly after these words. The hood, the rope, the signal. At 12:41, the trapdoor opened and Blobel fell. His body shook with spasms longer than the previous ones, requiring 7 minutes for the doctor to certify his death. Werner Braun, former commander of Sonderkommando 11B and organizer of the Simferopol massacre, was the fourth to be executed. At 12:49, he entered the room showing obvious signs of distress. At 42, he was the youngest of the condemned senior commanders. During the walk from his cell, he had required constant support, his legs barely able to support him. The Catholic chaplain accompanying him kept a hand on his shoulder as they slowly ascended the steps to the gallows. Braun was breathing heavily, and his face had lost all color. When the moment came for his final words, he could barely utter an audible sentence. "I followed orders." This statement, repeated so many times during his trial, now seemed devoid of any justification. It was an empty statement in the face of the imminent reality of his death. Procedures accelerated due to his obvious distress. The black hood covered his trembling face, and the rope was quickly secured. At 12:57, the trapdoor opened. Brauner's body shook for several seconds, a stark contrast to the efficiency he had demonstrated in orchestrating the deaths of thousands on the snowy fields of Crimea. After the first 4 executions, a technical break was taken to check the equipment and allow the staff a short rest. The night would continue with the executions of 3 more war criminals: Oswald Pohl, a senior concentration camp administrator, Hans Theodor Schmidt, deputy to the commandant of Buchenwald, and Georg Schallemeyer, a guard at Mühldorf. All were hanged following the same meticulous protocol, completing the 7 executions scheduled for that morning. Each body was examined by the military doctor who certified the deaths and oversaw the preparation of the remains. Following specific orders from the American High Command, the executed were to be buried in unmarked graves within the Spottinger Cemetery, adjacent to the prison. The graves were to bear only numbers without names or dates to prevent them from becoming pilgrimage sites for Nazi sympathizers. The entire procedure, from the first execution to the last, was carried out with military precision. Each step followed an established protocol: identification of the condemned man, reading of the sentence, offering of last words, placing of the hood and rope, activation of the mechanism, medical verification of death, removal and preparation of the body. This procedural meticulousness demonstrated the determination that these executions would be examples of orderly justice, not acts of revenge. The photographs taken during the executions remained in military custody, some such as the image of Paul Blobel moments before his execution, his face tense and the rope visible in the background, or that of Otto Ohlendorf already dead on a stretcher, would be declassified decades later. These images of undeniable rawness constitute historical documents that visually close the circle of responsibility the executioners turned into the executed. The international reaction to the executions was complex and varied. In Israel and among Holocaust survivor communities, the news was hailed as a belated but necessary culmination of justice. Rabbi Leo Bayek, a survivor of the Theresienstadt camp, declared, "Justice has spoken loudly. There is no peace without memory, no forgiveness without judgment." In West Germany, where society was beginning a complex process of reconstruction and denazification, opinions were divided. Some considered the executions to represent victors' justice, while others recognized the need for a definitive break with the Nazi past. The German press reported the events soberly, avoiding both condemnation and justification. In the United States, the executions received little media coverage. Public attention was focused on the Korean War, and the Einsatzgruppen trial had never achieved the notoriety of the Nuremberg main trials. However, in legal and diplomatic circles, it was considered a milestone in the development of international law on war crimes and genocide. Benjamin Ferencz, the prosecutor who had led the prosecution, received news of the executions with mixed feelings. Years later, he would write, "I felt not joy, but the solemn certainty that a fundamental principle had been established. Those who plan and execute the extermination of civilian populations must be personally responsible for their actions, regardless of the uniform they wear or the orders they claim to have followed." For the Jewish communities devastated by the Einsatzgruppen, the executions represented an act of historical justice, but they could not restore what had been lost. The villages and shtetls of Eastern Europe that had been systematically annihilated between 1941 and 1944 remained empty spaces marked by mass graves and traumatic memories. The Landsberg executions closed a legal chapter, but the historical wound would remain open for generations. The deaths of these commanders also meant the loss of direct sources on the internal organization of the genocide. Men like Ohlendorf had provided detailed testimony about the operational structure of the Einsatzgruppen, information that would prove invaluable to historians and jurists in the future. With their executions, that direct memory was extinguished, although it was preserved in the extensive records of the judicial proceedings. On a legal level, the Landsberg executions constituted the final implementation of the principles established at Nuremberg. They confirmed that responsibility for crimes against humanity is personal and non-transferable, that obedience to superior orders does not justify manifestly criminal actions, and that there is a universal standard of conduct that transcends national legislation or the circumstances of war. The anonymous graves in the Spottinger Cemetery, marked only by numbers, stood in stark contrast to the ambitions for glory and dominance that had animated these men. Otto Ohlendorf, Paul Blobel, Erich Naumann and Werner Braun, figures who had wielded the power of life and death over hundreds of thousands, now ended up as statistical data in a prison register, exactly the same status they had assigned to their countless victims.